As I sat in my car with those two girls on the side of a deserted mountain road, I knew for a fact that for the first time I had had a complete awareness of stopping the world. That feeling brought to my mind the memory of another similar first-time bodily awareness I had had years before. It had to do with the ticklishness on top of the head. Don Juan said that sorcerers had to cultivate such a sensation, and he described it at great length. According to him, it was a sort of itching which was neither pleasurable nor painful, and which occurred on the very top of one's head. In order to make me aware of it on an intellectual level, he described and analyzed its features, and then on the practical side, he attempted to guide me in developing the necessary bodily awareness and memory of this feeling by making me run under branches or rocks that protruded on a horizontal plane a few inches above my height. For years, I tried to follow what he was pointing out to me, but on the one hand, I was incapable of understanding what he meant by his description, and on the other hand, I was incapable of providing my body with the adequate memory by following his pragmatic steps. Never did I feel anything on top of my head as I ran underneath the branches or rocks he had selected for his demonstrations, but one day, my body by itself discovered the sensation while I was driving a high-panel truck into a 3-story parking structure. I entered the gate of the structure at the same speed I usually did in my small 2-door sedan. The result was that from the high seat of the truck I perceived the transverse cement beam of the roof coming at my head. I couldn't stop the truck in time, and the feeling I got was that the cement beam was scalping me. I had never driven a motor vehicle which was as high as that truck, thus I was incapable of making the necessary perceptual adjustments. The space between the roof of the truck and the roof of the parking structure seemed non-existent for me. I felt the beam with my scalp. That day, I drove for hours inside the structure, giving my body a chance to store the memory of that ticklish sensation. I faced the two girls and wanted to tell them that I had just found out where they lived. I desisted. There was no way of describing to them that the ticklish sensation had made me remember a casual remark that Don Juan had once made as we passed a house on our way to Pablito's place. He had pointed out an unusual feature in the surroundings and said that that house was an ideal place for quietness, but was not a place to rest. I drove them there. Their house was rather big. It was also an adobe structure with a tile roof like Doña Soledad's. It had one long room in the front, a roofed open-air kitchen in back of the house, a huge patio next to the kitchen, and an area for chickens beyond the patio. The most important part of their house, however, was a closed room with 2 doors, one opening to the front room and the other to the back. Lydia said that they had built it themselves. I wanted to see it, but both of them said that it wasn't the appropriate time because Josefina and La Gorda were not present to show me the parts of the room that belonged to them. In the corner of the front room, there was a sizable built-in brick platform. It was about 18 inches high and had been constructed like a bed with one end against the wall. Lydia put some thick straw mats on its flat top and urged me to lie down and sleep while they watched over me. Rosa had lit a lantern and hung it on a nail above the bed. There was enough light to write. I explained to them that writing eased my tension and asked if it bothered them. "Why do you have to ask?" Lydia retorted. "Just do it." In the vein of a perfunctory explanation, I had told them that I had always done some things, such as taking notes, which were strange even to Don Juan and Don Genaro and would perforce be strange to them. "We all do strange things," Lydia said dryly. I sat down on the bed under the lantern, with my back against the wall. They lay down next to me, one on each side. Rosa covered herself with a blanket and went to sleep as if all she needed to do was to lie down. Lydia said that then was the appropriate time and place for us to talk, although she would prefer that I turn off the light because it made her sleepy. Our conversation in the darkness centered around the whereabouts of the other two girls. She said that she couldn't even imagine where La Gorda was, but that Josefina was undoubtedly in the mountains, still looking for Nestor, even though it was dark. She explained that Josefina was the most capable one to take care of herself in eventualities, such as being in a deserted place in the dark. That was the reason why La Gorda had selected her to run that errand. I mentioned that in listening to them talk about La Gorda, I had formed the opinion that she was the boss. Lydia replied that La Gorda was indeed in charge, and that the Nagual himself had put her in command. She added that even if he hadn't done so, La Gorda would have taken over sooner or later, because she was the best. I was compelled at that point to light the lantern in order to write. Lydia complained that the light made it impossible to stay awake, but I prevailed. "What makes La Gorda the best?" I asked. "She has more personal power," she said. "She knows everything. Besides, the Nagual taught her how to control people." "Do you envy La Gorda for being the best?" "I used to, but not now." "Why did you change?" "I finally accepted my fate, as the Nagual told me." "And what is your fate?" My fate? My fate is to be the breeze, to be a dreamer. My fate is to be a warrior." "Do Rosa or Josefina envy La Gorda?" "No, they don't. All of us have accepted our fates." The Nagual said that power comes only after we accept our fate without recriminations. I used to complain a lot and feel terrible because I liked the Nagual. I thought I was a woman, but he showed me that I was not. He showed me that I was a warrior. My life had ended before I met him. This body that you see here is new. The same thing happened to all of us. Perhaps you were not like us, but to us, the Nagual was a new life. When he told us that he was going to leave because he had to do other things, we thought we would die. But look at us now. We're alive. And do you know why? Because the Nagual showed us that we were himself. He's here with us. He'll always be here. We are his body and his spirit. Do all four of you feel the same way? We are not four. We are one. That is our fate. We have to carry each other, and you are the same. All of us are the same. Even Soledad is the same, although she goes in a different direction. And Pablito, Nestor, and Benigno? Where do they fit? We don't know. We don't like them. Especially Pablito. He's a coward. He hasn't accepted his fate and wants to wriggle out of it. He even wants to chuck his chances as a sorcerer and live an ordinary life. That'll be great for Soledad, but the Nagual gave us orders to help him. We're getting tired of helping him, though. Maybe one of these days La Gorda will push him out of the way forever. Can she do that? Can she do that? Of course she can. She's got more of the Nagual than the rest of us, perhaps even more than you. Why do you think the Nagual never told me that you were his apprentices? Because you're empty. Did he say that I was empty? Everyone knows you're empty. It's written on your body. How can you tell that? There's a hole in the middle. In the middle of my body? Where? She very gently touched a spot on the right side of my stomach. She drew a circle with her finger as if she were following the edges of an invisible hole 4 or 5 inches in diameter. Are you empty yourself, Lydia? Are you kidding? I'm complete. Can't you see? Her answers to my questions were taking a turn that I hadn't expected. I didn't want to antagonize her with my ignorance. I shook my head affirmatively. Why do you think I have a hole here that makes me empty? I asked, after deliberating what the most innocent question would be. She didn't answer. She turned her back to me and complained that the light of the lantern bothered her eyes. I insisted on a response. She faced me defiantly. I don't want to talk to you anymore, she said. You are stupid. Not even Pablito is that stupid, and he's the worst. I didn't want to end up in another blind alley by pretending that I knew what she was talking about, so I asked her again what caused my emptiness. I coaxed her to talk, giving her ample assurances that Don Juan had never explained that topic to me. He had said time and again that I was empty, and I understood him the way any Western man would understand that statement. I thought he meant that I was somehow void of determination, will, purpose, or even intelligence. He had never spoken to me about a hole in my body. There is a hole there on the right side, she said matter-of-factly. A hole that a woman made when she emptied you. Would you know who the woman is? Only you can tell that. The Nagual said that men most of the time cannot tell who had emptied them. Women are more fortunate. They know for a fact who emptied them. Are your sisters empty, like me? Don't be stupid. How can they be empty? Doña Soledad said that she was empty. Does she look like me? No. The hole in her stomach was enormous. It was on both sides, which meant that a man and a woman emptied her. What did Doña Soledad do with a man and a woman? She gave her completeness to them. I vacillated for a moment before asking the next question. I wanted to assess all the implications of her statement. La Gorda was even worse than Soledad, Lydia went on. 2 women emptied her. The hole in her stomach was like a cavern, but now she's closed it. She is complete again. Tell me about those 2 women. I just can't tell you anything more, she said in a most imperative tone. Only La Gorda can speak to you about this matter. Wait until she comes. Why only La Gorda? Because she knows everything. Is she the only one who knows everything? The witness knows as much, maybe even more, but he is Genaro himself, and that makes him very difficult to handle. We don't like him. Why don't you like him? Those 3 bums are awful. They're crazy like Genaro. Well, they are Genaro himself. They're always fighting us because they were afraid of the Nagual, and now they're taking their revenge on us. That's what La Gorda says, anyway. And what makes La Gorda say that? The Nagual told her things he didn't tell the rest of us. She sees. The Nagual said that you also see. Josefina, Rosa, and I don't see, and yet all 5 of us are the same. We are the same. The phrase, we are the same, which Doña Soledad had used the night before, brought on an avalanche of thoughts and fears. I put my writing pad away. I looked around. I was in a strange world, lying in a strange bed in between 2 young women I didn't know. And yet I felt at ease there. My body experienced abandon and indifference. I trusted them. Are you going to sleep here? I asked. Where else? How about your own room? We can't leave you alone. We feel the same way you do. You are a stranger, except that we are bound to help you. La Gorda said that no matter how stupid you are, we have to look after you. She said we have to sleep in the same bed with you as if you were the Nagual himself. Lydia turned off the lantern. I remained sitting with my back against the wall. I closed my eyes to think, and I fell asleep instantly. Lydia, Rosa, and I had been sitting on a flat area just outside the front door for nearly 2 hours, since 8 o'clock in the morning. I had tried to steer them into a conversation, but they had refused to talk. They seemed to be very relaxed, almost asleep. Their mood of abandonment wasn't contagious, however. Sitting there in that forced silence had put me into a mood of my own. Their house sat on top of a small hill. The front door faced the east. From where I sat, I could see almost the entire narrow valley that ran from east to west. I couldn't see the town, but I could see the green areas of cultivated fields on the floor of the valley. On the other side and flanking the valley in every direction there were gigantic, round, eroded hills. There were no high mountains in the vicinity of the valley, only those enormous, eroded round hills, the sight of which created in me the most intense feeling of oppression. I had the sensation that those hills were about to transport me to another time. Lydia spoke to me all of a sudden, and her voice disrupted my reverie. She pulled my sleeve. "Here comes Josefina," she said. I looked at the winding trail that led from the valley to the house. I saw a woman walking slowly up the trail, perhaps 50 yards away. I noticed immediately the remarkable difference in age between Lydia and Rosa and the approaching woman. I looked at her again. I would never have thought Josefina to be that old. Judging by her slow gait and the posture of her body, she seemed to be a woman in her mid-50s. She was thin, wore a long, dark skirt, and was carrying a load of firewood on her back. She had a bundle tied around her waist. It looked as though she had a bundled-up child riding on her left hip. She seemed to be breastfeeding it as she walked. Her steps were almost feeble. She could barely make the last steep slope before reaching the house. When she finally stood in front of us a few yards away, she was panting so heavily that I attempted to help her sit down. She made a gesture that seemed to say that she was all right. I heard Lydia and Rosa giggling. I didn't look at them because my total attention had been taken by assault. The woman in front of me was absolutely the most disgusting, foul creature I had ever seen. She untied the bundle of firewood and dropped it on the floor with a loud clatter. I jumped involuntarily, due in part to the loud noise and in part to the fact that the woman nearly fell on my lap, pulled by the weight of the wood. She looked at me for an instant and then lowered her eyes, seemingly embarrassed by her clumsiness. She straightened her back and sighed with apparent relief. Obviously, the load had been too great for her old body. As she stretched her arms, her hair fell partially loose. She was wearing a soiled headband tied over her forehead. Her hair was long and graying and seemed dirty and matted. I could see the white hairs against the dark brown of the headband. She smiled at me and sort of nodded her head. All her teeth seemed to be missing. I could see the black hole of her toothless mouth. She covered her face with her hand and laughed. She took off her sandals and walked into the house without giving me time to say anything. Rosa followed her. I was dumbfounded. Doña Soledad had implied that Josefina was the same age as Lydia and Rosa. I turned to Lydia. She was peering at me. "I had no idea she was that old," I said. "Yes, she's pretty old," she said in a matter-of-fact tone. "Does she have a child?" I asked. "Yes, and she takes him everywhere. She never leaves him with us. She's afraid we're going to eat him." "Is it a boy?" "A boy." "How old is he?" "She's had him for some time, but I don't know his age. We thought that she shouldn't have a child at her age. But she didn't pay any attention to us." "Whose child is he?" "Josefina's, of course." "I mean, who's the father?" "The Nagual. Who else?" I thought that development was quite extravagant and very unnerving. "I suppose anything is possible in the Nagual's world," I said. I meant it more as a thought to myself than a statement made to Lydia. "You bet," she said, and laughed. The oppressiveness of those eroded hills became unbearable. There was something truly abhorrent about that area, and Josefina had been the final blow. On top of having an ugly, old, smelly body and no teeth, she also seemed to have some sort of facial paralysis. The muscles on the left side of her face appeared to be injured, a condition which created a most unpleasant distortion of her left eye and the left side of her mouth. My oppressive mood plummeted to one of sheer anguish. For an instant, I toyed with the idea, so familiar by then, of running to my car and driving away. I complained to Lydia that I didn't feel well. She laughed and said that Josefina had no doubt scared me. "She has that effect on people," she said. "Everybody hates her guts. She's uglier than a cockroach." I remember seeing her once, I said, but she was young. Things change, Lydia said philosophically. One way or another. Look at Soledad. What a change, huh? And you yourself have changed. You look more massive than I remember you. You are looking more and more like the Nagual. I wanted to say that the change in Josefina was abhorrent, but I was afraid that she might overhear me. I looked at the eroded hills across the valley. I felt like fleeing from them. The Nagual gave us this house, she said, but it is not a house for rest. We had another house before that was truly beautiful. This is a place to steam up. Those mountains over there will drive you nuts. Her boldness in reading my feelings gave me a respite. I didn't know what to say. We're all naturally lazy, she went on. We don't like to strain ourselves. The Nagual knew that, so he must have figured that this place would drive us up the walls. She stood up abruptly and said that she wanted something to eat. We went to the kitchen, a semi-enclosed area with only 2 walls. At the open end, to the right of the door, there was an earthen stove. At the other end, where the 2 walls met, there was a large dining area with a long table and 3 benches. The floor was paved with smooth river rocks. The flat roof was about 10 feet high and was resting on the 2 walls and on thick supporting beams on the open sides. Lydia poured me a bowl of beans and meat from a pot which cooked on a very low fire. She heated up some tortillas over the fire. Rosa came in and sat down next to me and asked Lydia to serve her some food. I became immersed in watching Lydia use a ladle to scoop the beans and meat. She seemed to have an eye for the exact amount. She must have been aware that I was admiring her maneuvers. She took 2 or 3 beans from Rosa's bowl and returned them to the pot. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Josefina coming into the kitchen. I didn't look at her, though. She sat facing me across the table. I had a squeamish feeling in my stomach. I felt that I couldn't eat with that woman looking at me. To ease my tension, I joked with Lydia that there were still 2 extra beans in Rosa's bowl that she had overlooked. She scooped up 2 beans with the ladle with a precision that made me gasp. I laughed nervously, knowing that once Lydia sat down, I would have to move my eyes from the stove and acknowledge the presence of Josefina. I finally and reluctantly had to look across the table at Josefina. There was a dead silence. I stared at her incredulously. My mouth fell open. I heard the loud laughter of Lydia and Rosa. It took an endless moment for me to put my thoughts and feelings in some sort of order. Whoever was facing me was not the Josefina I had seen just a while ago, but a very pretty girl. She didn't have Indian features as Lydia and Rosa did. She seemed to be more Latin than Indian. She had a light olive complexion, a very small mouth, and a finely chiseled nose, small white teeth, and short, black, curly hair. She had a dimple on the left side of her face, which gave a definite cockiness to her smile. She was the girl I had met briefly years ago. She held my scrutiny. Her eyes were friendly. I became possessed by degrees with some uncontrollable nervousness. I ended up desperately clowning about my genuine bewilderment. They laughed like children. After their laughter had subsided, I wanted to know what was the point of Josefina's histrionic display. She's practicing the art of stalking, Lydia said. The Nagual taught us to baffle people so they wouldn't notice us. Josefina's very pretty, and if she walks alone at night, no one will bother her if she is ugly and smelly. But if she goes out as she really is, well, you yourself can tell what would happen. Josefina nodded affirmatively and then contorted her face into the ugliest grimace possible. She can hold that face all day, Lydia said. I contended that if I lived around that area, I would certainly notice Josefina in her disguise more readily than if she didn't have one. That disguise was just for you, Lydia said, and all 3 of them laughed. And look how it baffled you. You noticed her child even more than you noticed her. Lydia went into the room and brought out a package of rags that looked like a bundled-up child and threw it on the table in front of me. I laughed uproariously with them. Do all of you have particular disguises? I asked. No, only Josefina. No one around here knows her as she really is, Lydia replied. Josefina nodded and smiled, but she remained silent. I liked her tremendously. There was something so very innocent and sweet about her. Say something, Josefina, I said, grabbing her by her forearms. She looked at me, bewildered, and recoiled. I thought that I had gotten carried away by my elation and perhaps grabbed her too hard. I let her go. She sat up straight. She contorted her small mouth and thin lips and produced a most grotesque outburst of grunts and shrieks. Her whole face suddenly changed. A series of ugly, involuntary spasms marred her tranquil expression of a moment before. I looked at her, horrified. Lydia pulled me by the sleeve. Why do you have to scare her, stupid? She whispered. Don't you know that she became mute and can't talk at all? Josefina obviously understood her and seemed bent on protesting. She clenched her fist at Lydia and let out another outburst of extremely loud and horrifying shrieks, and then choked and coughed. Rosa began to rub her back. Lydia tried to do the same, but Josefina nearly hit her in the face. Lydia sat down next to me and made a gesture of impotence. She shrugged her shoulders. She's that way? Lydia whispered to me. Josefina turned to her. Her face was contorted in a most ugly grimace of anger. She opened her mouth and bellowed at the top of her voice some more frightening, guttural sounds. Lydia slid off the bench and in a most unobtrusive manner left the kitchen area. Rosa held Josefina by the arm. Josefina seemed to be the epitome of fury. She moved her mouth and contorted her face. In a matter of minutes, she had lost all the beauty and innocence that had enchanted me. I didn't know what to do. I tried to apologize, but Josefina's inhuman sounds drowned out my words. Finally, Rosa took her into the house. Lydia returned and sat across the table from me. Something went wrong up here, she said, touching her head. When did it happen? I asked. A long time ago. The Nagual must have done something to her, because all of a sudden she lost her speech. Lydia seemed sad. I had the impression that her sadness showed against her desire. I even felt tempted to tell her not to struggle so hard to hide her emotions. How does Josefina communicate with you people? I asked. Does she write? Come on, don't be silly. She doesn't write. She's not you. She uses her hands and feet to tell us what she wants. Josefina and Rosa came back to the kitchen. They stood by my side. I thought that Josefina was again the picture of innocence and candor. Her beatific expression didn't give the slightest inkling of the fact that she could become so ugly so fast. Looking at her, I had the sudden realization that her fabulous ability for gestures undoubtedly was intimately linked to her aphasia. I reasoned that only a person who had lost her capacity to verbalize could be so versed in mimicry. Rosa said that Josefina had confided that she wished she could talk because she liked me very much. Until you came, she was happy the way she was, Lydia said in a harsh voice. Josefina shook her head affirmatively, corroborating Lydia's statement, and went into a mild outburst of sounds. I wish La Gorda was here, Rosa said. Lydia always gets Josefina angry. I don't mean to, Lydia protested. Josefina smiled at her and extended her arm to touch her. It seemed as if she was attempting to apologize. Lydia brushed her hand away. Why, you mute imbecile, she muttered. Josefina didn't get angry. She looked away. There was so much sadness in her eyes that I didn't want to look at her. I felt compelled to intercede. She thinks she's the only woman in the world who has problems, Lydia snapped at me. The Nagual told us to drive her hard and without mercy until she no longer feels sorry for herself. Rosa looked at me and reaffirmed Lydia's claim with a nod of her head. Lydia turned to Rosa and ordered her to leave Josefina's side. Rosa moved away complyingly and sat on the bench next to me. The Nagual said that one of these days she will talk again, Lydia said to me. Hey, Rosa said, pulling my sleeve. Maybe you're the one who'll make her talk. Yes, Lydia exclaimed, as if she had had the same thought. Maybe that's why we had to wait for you. It's so clear, Rosa added, with the expression of having had a true revelation. Both of them jumped to their feet and embraced Josefina. You're going to talk again, Rosa exclaimed as she shook Josefina by the shoulders. Josefina opened her eyes and rolled them. She started making faint, muffled sighs as if she were sobbing and ended up running back and forth, crying like an animal. Her excitation was so great that she seemed to have locked her jaws open. I honestly thought she was on the brink of a nervous breakdown. Lydia and Rosa ran to her side and helped her close her mouth, but they didn't try to calm her down. You're going to talk again! You're going to talk again! They shouted. Josefina sobbed and howled in a manner that sent chills down my spine. I was absolutely confounded. I tried to talk sense to them. I appealed to their reason, but then I realized that they had very little of it, by my standards. I paced back and forth in front of them, trying to figure out what to do. You are going to help her, aren't you? Lydia demanded. Please, sir, please, Rosa pleaded with me. I told them that they were crazy, that I couldn't possibly know what to do. And yet as I talked, I noticed that there was a funny feeling of optimism and certainty in the back of my mind. I wanted to discard it at first, but it took hold of me. Once before I had had a similar feeling in relation to a dear friend of mine who was mortally ill. I thought I could make her well and actually leave the hospital where she lay dying. I even consulted Don Juan about it. Sure, you can cure her and make her walk out of that death trap, he said. How? I asked him. It's a very simple procedure, he said. All you have to do is remind her that she's an incurable patient. Since she's a terminal case, she has power. She has nothing to lose anymore. She's lost everything already. When one has nothing to lose, one becomes courageous. We are timid only when there is something we can still cling to. But is it enough just to remind her of that? No, that will give her the boost she needs. Then she has to push the disease away with her left hand. She must push her arm out in front of her, with her hand clenched as if she were holding a knob. She must push on and on as she says, out, out, out. Tell her that, since she has nothing else to do, she must dedicate every second of her remaining life to performing that movement. I assure you that she can get up and walk away if she wants to. It sounds so simple, I said. Don Juan chuckled. It seems simple, he said, but it isn't. In order to do this, your friend needs an impeccable spirit. He looked at me for a long time. He seemed to be measuring the concern and sadness I felt for my friend. Of course, he added, if your friend had an impeccable spirit, she wouldn't be there in the first place. I told my friend what Don Juan had said, but she was already too weak even to attempt to move her arm. In Josefina's case, my rationale for my secret confidence was the fact that she was a warrior with an impeccable spirit. Would it be possible, I silently asked myself, to apply the same hand movement to her? I told Josefina that her incapacity to speak was due to some sort of blockage. Yes, it's a blockage, Lydia and Rosa repeated after me. I explained to Josefina the arm movement and told her that she had to push that blockage by moving her arm in that fashion. Josefina's eyes were transfixed. She seemed to be in a trance. She moved her mouth, making barely audible sounds. She tried moving her arm, but her excitation was so intense that she flung her arm without any coordination. I tried to redirect her movements, but she appeared to be so thoroughly befuddled that she couldn't even hear what I was saying. Her eyes went out of focus, and I knew she was going to faint. Rosa apparently realized what was happening. She jumped away and grabbed a cup of water and sprinkled it over Josefina's face. Josefina's eyes rolled back, showing the whites of her eyes. She blinked repeatedly until she could focus her eyes again. She moved her mouth, but she made no sound. "Touch her throat," Rosa yelled at me. "No, no," Lydia shouted back. "Touch her head. It's in her head, you dummy." She grabbed my hand, and I reluctantly let her place it on Josefina's head. Josefina shivered, and little by little she let out a series of faint sounds. Somehow they seemed to me more melodious than the inhuman sounds she made before. Rosa also must have noticed the difference. "Did you hear that? Did you hear that?" she asked me in a whisper. But whatever the difference might have been, Josefina let out another series of sounds more grotesque than ever. When she quieted down, she sobbed for a moment and then entered into another state of euphoria. Lydia and Rosa finally quieted her. She plunked down on the bench, apparently exhausted. She could barely lift her eyelids to look at me. She smiled meekly. "I am so very, very sorry," I said, and held her hand. Her whole body vibrated. She lowered her head and began to weep again. I felt a surge of ultimate empathy for her. At that moment, I would have given my life to help her. She sobbed uncontrollably as she tried to speak to me. Lydia and Rosa appeared to be so caught up in her drama that they were making the same gestures with their mouths. "For heaven's sake, do something!" Rosa exclaimed in a pleading voice. I experienced an unbearable anxiety. Josefina stood up and embraced me, or rather clung to me in a frenzy and pushed me away from the table. At that instant, Lydia and Rosa, with astounding agility, speed, and control, grabbed me by the shoulders with both hands and at the same time hooked the heels of my feet with their feet. The weight of Josefina's body and her embrace, plus the speed of Lydia and Rosa's maneuver, rendered me helpless. They all moved at once, and before I knew what was happening, they had laid me on the floor with Josefina on top of me. I felt her heart pounding. She held on to me with great force. The sound of her heart reverberated in my ears. I felt it pounding in my own chest. I tried to push her away, but she held on fast. Rosa and Lydia had me pinned down on the floor with their weight on my arms and legs. Rosa cackled insanely and began nibbling on my side. Her small, sharp teeth chattered as her jaws snapped open and shut with nervous spasms. All at once, I had a monstrous sensation of pain, physical revulsion, and terror. I lost my breath. My eyes couldn't focus. I knew that I was passing out. I heard then the dry, cracking sound of a pipe breaking at the base of my neck and felt the ticklish sensation on top of my head running like a shiver through my entire body. The next thing I knew, I was looking at them from the other side of the kitchen. The three girls were staring at me while they lay on the floor. "What are you people doing?" I heard someone say in a loud, harsh, commanding voice. I then had an inconceivable feeling. I felt Josefina let go of me and stand up. I was lying on the floor, and yet I was also standing a distance away from them, looking at a woman I had never seen before. She was by the door. She walked toward me and stopped 6 or 7 feet away. She stared at me for a moment. I knew immediately that she was La Gorda. She demanded to know what was going on. "We were just playing a little joke on him," Josefina said, clearing her throat. "I was pretending to be mute." The three girls huddled up close together and began to laugh. La Gorda remained impassive, looking at me. They had tricked me. I found my stupidity and gullibility so outrageous that I had a fit of hysterical laughter which was almost out of control. My body shivered. I knew that Josefina had not just been playing, as she had claimed. The three of them had meant business. I had actually felt Josefina's body as a force that, in fact, was getting inside my own body. Rosa's nibbling on my side, which undoubtedly was a ruse to distract my attention, coincided with the sensation I had had that Josefina's heart was pounding inside my chest. I heard La Gorda urging me to calm down. I had a nervous flutter in my midsection, and then a quiet, calm anger swept over me. I loathed them. I had had enough of them. I would have picked up my jacket and writing pad and walked out of the house had it not been that I wasn't quite myself yet. I was somewhat dizzy, and my senses were definitely out of line. I had had the sensation that when I had first looked at the girls from across the kitchen, I was actually viewing them from a position above my eye level, from a place close to the ceiling. But something even more disconcerting was that I had actually perceived that the ticklish sensation on top of my head was what scooped me from Josefina's embrace. It was not as if something came out from the top of my head. Something actually did come out from the top of my head. A few years before, Don Juan and Don Genaro had maneuvered my perception, and I had had an impossible double sensation. I felt that Don Juan had fallen on top of me and pinned me to the ground, while at the same time I felt I was still standing up. I was actually in both places at once. In sorcerer's terms, I could say that my body had stored the memory of that double perception and seemed to have repeated it. There were, however, two new things that had been added to my bodily memory this time. One was that the ticklish sensation I had become so aware of during the course of my confrontations with those women was the vehicle to arriving at that double perception, and the other was that the sound at the base of my neck let loose something in me that was capable of coming out of the top of my head. After a minute or two, I definitely felt that I was coming down from near the ceiling until I was standing on the floor. It took a while for my eyes to adjust to seeing at my normal eye level. As I looked at the four women, I felt naked and vulnerable. I then had an instant of disassociation or lack of perceptual continuity. It was as if I had shut my eyes and some force suddenly had made me twirl a couple of times. When I opened my eyes, the girls were staring at me with their mouths open. But somehow, I was myself again.